I felt the heat rising off the pavement before I even saw the truck. The kind of heat that makes whole streets look like they're breathing. I had just turned onto my road, thinking about nothing more than a cold drink and a quiet evening, when the world shifted. A white pickup rolled around the corner too fast, gliding over the asphalt like a shark cutting through dark water. It didn't stop at the curb. It didn't slow down. It lunged, blocked the street, boxed me in without hesitation or apology. And the second I saw how it stopped, angled, aggressive, intentional, I knew peace was over. Before I could take another step, the doors burst open like someone kicked them from the inside. Two men in tactical vests jumped out, moving like wannabe SWAT officers who had binge-watched too many action movies. Sunglasses on, radios clipped to their shoulders, boots polished like they'd never seen dirt. Everything about them screamed fake authority, except for the weight on their belts. Before we go any further, comment below, where are you watching from right now? The tall one stepped forward first. His boots thudded against the pavement with a confidence he hadn't earned. His name tag said Mason, but he wore it like a title, not a label. He planted himself in my path like he owned the street, chin raised, jaw tight, eyes narrowed behind cheap glass. He gave me a smile that wasn't a smile. It was a threat wearing teeth. "Afternoon," he said, voice soaked in smugness. "We've received reports you've been violating community standards." His partner came around the truck, smaller, twitchy, eyes darting like he wasn't fully convinced this was a good idea. His vest hung crooked, his radio crackled with static, and worst of all, his hand hovered too close to something no wannabe enforcer should ever carry. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I just observed, cataloging every twitch, every angle, every second. Navy SEAL training doesn't switch off when you leave the military. It becomes instinct. And instinct was screaming that these two weren't here to talk. The tall one took a step closer. "We need to clear up a few issues. Fines, warnings, non-compliance." The wind carried his voice, but not his authority. He waited for me to look intimidated. I didn't oblige. My silence rattled him. He glanced at his partner as if looking for backup, but the twitchy one didn't look ready for anything, least of all a confrontation. Then I saw it. Not a toy, not airsoft, not plastic. A gun. A real one. Holstered sloppily. Positioned wrong. Tension on his face, screaming he had no training to handle it. That was the moment everything slowed. Not fear, not panic. Just clarity. Cold, absolute clarity. Scared men with guns don't follow logic. They follow adrenaline. They follow ego. They follow stupidity. And stupidity with a loaded weapon kills people. "What's this about?" I asked finally, my voice level, calm, controlled. I wasn't being brave. I was being measured. The twitchy one's fingers twitched near the holster, confirming every suspicion I had about why they'd come. He looked at Mason, then back at me, like he needed permission to breathe. These weren't cops. These weren't even security. These were two idiots who had mistaken power for competence. Mason adjusted his vest. "We've told you before. The HOA rules apply to everyone. You don't get special treatment because you think you're different." He said it like he'd practiced in the mirror. The twitchy one stared at me like he was waiting for something. Fear, anger, resistance, anything. But I didn't give him what he expected. "I'm walking home," I said. "Step aside." My tone wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. But my calmness rattled him more than any threat could have. Mason's lips curled as if my refusal offended him personally. He stepped into my path again. "Sir, we're not asking." Then it happened. The moment the story turned. The moment the afternoon snapped in half. The twitchy one drew his weapon. Not fully, but enough. His hand pulled the grip. His thumb hovered. The barrel tipped, catching sunlight like a blade. He pointed it at the ground near my feet. Not a warning shot, an emotional tantrum disguised as authority. His shoulders shook. His breathing stuttered. I'd seen this exact look overseas. The look of a man who wants to appear dangerous but is terrified of actually firing. "Don't move," he said. "We have questions." His voice cracked on the last word. Violations of fury. Control, revenge. Justice. All sparked in a single flash of heat under my ribs. My right hand slid behind my back. Slow, silent, natural. It found the Glock 19 tucked beneath my shirt. Legal, loaded, familiar as breathing. "You're not police," I said. "Take your hand off that weapon." My voice didn't rise. It didn't shake. It didn't tremble. Stillness is what scares men like him. The twitchy one stiffened. Mason scoffed, trying to save face. "You think that matters? We're authorized by the HOA President, and you've been warned." There it was. The lie they'd built their power on. The lie Tina Marsh had whispered into their egos. The lie that made men like them think they were untouchable. "That's not even the half of it," I said, calmly shifting my weight, "because you're impersonating law enforcement." Mason barked a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Look at him," he said to his partner, hands behind his back. "He's scared." He thought fear looked like restraint. He had no idea restraint was the last warning he'd ever get. The twitchy one jerked his weapon up. Too fast, too sloppy, too deadly. In that half-second of reckless movement, the world narrowed to a point. Combat reflex overrode everything else. My shoulder dipped, my stance tightened, my hand locked around the Glock. Breath in, grip firm, timing perfect. A whisper of instinct. Move now. Here's where everything blew apart. My voice dropped to a low, deadly calm. "You really don't want to do this." But they already had. In that frozen instant, before chaos exploded, before decisions became consequences, before two fake cops learned what a real one looks like, I said the words that turned their confidence into terror. "I'm Navy SEAL." And the street went silent. The second those two fake cops froze at the words, Navy SEAL, the air changed. I could feel their fear spreading across the pavement like heat from a wildfire. They didn't lower their weapons. They didn't step back. They didn't apologize. They simply stalled, too proud to retreat, too shaken to move forward. And in that cracked open silence, the past I had tried so hard to leave behind rose up like a shadow stretching over all three of us. People think military service ends the moment you take off the uniform. It doesn't. It stays in your bones, your breath, the instinctive way your eyes find exits and threats without thinking. It follows you into civilian life, into quiet neighborhoods that pretend they're safe, into HOA communities that look peaceful on the surface, but hide predators who don't know their prey. I didn't choose Oak Ridge Meadows because it was special. I chose it because it was quiet. I'd spent 10 years in environments where the sky could flash white without warning, and metal could rain from rooftops. I'd seen chaos so loud it ruptured eardrums and silence so heavy it predicted death. That kind of experience changes something inside you. Not paranoia, precision, awareness, discipline. After I came home, all I wanted was a place where my pulse didn't spike from a car door slamming or a window creaking. A place where I could breathe without calculating risk. So I bought a house on a calm street, surrounded by families who waved when you passed, kids who left bikes on lawns, neighbors who planted the same flowers every spring. Peace. I wasn't running from my past. I was running toward a future that didn't involve threats. Then Tina Marsh crawled into it. Tina was the type of person who should never taste authority, not even a teaspoon of it. Because once she got the title HOA President, she drank it like it was oxygen. She ran the neighborhood with more intensity than some officers run battalions. She loved rules, control, regulations, and most importantly, submissive residents. She spoke like every disagreement was treason. She wrote emails like they were orders. She held meetings as if she expected everyone to stand at attention. The first time she approached me, she acted like she was reviewing a recruit. Eyes narrowed, shoulders stiff, voice clipped. "We expect everyone to follow community standards," she said, as if she was revealing a sacred law I'd never heard. I gave her a polite nod. "Ma'am, following rules is something I've spent most of my life doing." She didn't appreciate the calm. People like her never do. Calm feels like resistance. From that moment, I became her obsession. Citations began showing up like unwanted souvenirs. Improper storage of tools. Unauthorized yard equipment. Trash cans visible for 9 extra minutes. The kind of violations you invent when you need to feel important. I ignored most of them. I'd seen worse paperwork. I'd held documents that determined life or death. An HOA warning felt like a bad joke. But Tina wasn't joking. She escalated. She always escalated. She started walking past my house 3, 4, 5 times a day, timing my lawn maintenance, measuring my hedges, trying to catch me outside so she could lecture me about neighborhood image. I stayed courteous, respectful, detached. Not because I feared her, but because I refused to let a suburban tyrant pull me into her fantasy. But then she did something dangerous. She formed her own HOA security division. 2 men she handpicked, 2 untrained, unlicensed, unstable men who were desperate for purpose and attention. Mason, the tall one, strutted around like he was leading a tactical raid every time he approached a mailbox. He wore boots meant for terrain he'd never walk. His vest was always zipped tight, as if he thought danger could appear in a gated neighborhood where the biggest threat was a raccoon in the trash. His partner, he was the real problem, pale, nervous, eyes darting like he expected something to explode at any moment. You can teach a man to shoot, you can teach him to march, you can even teach him to bluff, but you cannot teach steadiness, and he had none. The first time they approached me, I recognized the danger immediately, not in their weapons, but in their confidence. The most reckless men are the ones with borrowed authority. They thought their vests made them powerful. They thought Tina's praise made them legitimate. They thought waving fake badges made them tough. Men like that are unpredictable, and unpredictability is deadlier than skill. They showed up one afternoon on my driveway, radios hissing, sunglasses reflecting the sun. "Routine compliance review," Mason announced. His partner let his hand hover too close to his waistband again. I warned them once, calm, clear, direct. "Step on my property again, and I'll have you charged for trespassing." Mason grinned. "We've got authority here." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain the law. I simply said, "Not over me," and shut the door. If they had been smarter, that would have been the end. But weak leaders breed reckless followers. And Tina was the weakest leader I'd ever seen. She fed them praise like scraps to starving dogs. She rewarded their aggression. She encouraged their delusion. She made them feel invincible. And the more invincible they felt, the more dangerous they became. They started patrolling the neighborhood at night, shining lights into windows, stopping teens on sidewalks, demanding identification from joggers. The board didn't approve it. Residents didn't vote on it. Tina created her own enforcement unit because it made her feel feared. And fear was her favorite currency. I noticed the shift in the neighborhood immediately. The way people avoided eye contact. The way families kept children inside a little longer. The way quiet conversations stopped when Mason walked past. Fear was spreading because Tina nurtured it. She thrived on it. And the two wannabe cops were her eager tools. But even tools break, and sometimes they break inward. The day before the gun was pulled on me, I caught Mason following me in his truck at a slow, crawling pace. He gave me a smug wave when I noticed him. Not friendly, provocative, testing boundaries. The twitchy one was in the passenger seat, gripping something in his lap like a talisman. I didn't engage. I didn't escalate. I kept walking. But inside, one thought settled with the weight of certainty. This would not stay harmless. Because nothing ever stays harmless when men with unstable egos taste unlawful power. I spent years studying people under pressure. Soldiers, insurgents, civilians in chaos. And the truth never changes. Some men collapse when they gain authority. Others become monsters. Mason wasn't dangerous because he was confident. He was dangerous because he wasn't. He performed toughness like it was theater. The twitchy one wasn't dangerous because he carried a gun. He was dangerous because fear ruled him. A fearful man with a weapon is a coin toss that can land on death. And Tina? She was the spark. She set all this in motion. She fueled their egos. She encouraged their aggression. She wrote them into her own fantasy of control, but fantasies collapse under pressure. And pressure was coming. By the time the white pickup cut me off in the street, everything made sense. The escalating citations, the late-night patrols, the lingering stares, the fake authority. It all led to one truth. These two idiots thought they had found the one homeowner who would break under intimidation. They thought they could corner me, threaten me, force me into submission. They didn't know I had survived worse. They didn't know I'd been trained to read danger like a map. They didn't know I'd spent years learning how to neutralize threats before they even understood they were threatening me. They saw a man walking home. They didn't see the training. They didn't see the discipline. They didn't see the decade of combat sharpened behind every breath I took. But they were about to, because the violation happened the moment that gun lifted. The fury rose when they blocked my path. The control came the moment I steadied my stance. Revenge would come soon enough. And justice? Justice was already on its way. The truth about Oak Ridge Meadows was simple. It looked peaceful from the outside, but the deeper you lived in it, the more you realized the whole neighborhood was built on a foundation of fear. Fear created, controlled, and deliberately maintained by one woman who had no business holding authority over a lemonade stand, much less an entire community. Tina Marsh wasn't just an HOA president. She was a self-appointed monarch ruling over a kingdom she believed she built with her own two hands. And every tyrant needs enforcers. Every tyrant needs someone willing to carry out threats. Every tyrant needs followers desperate enough to confuse attention with purpose. Tina found both in Mason and his twitchy partner. To understand why those two wannabe soldiers felt brave enough to draw a weapon on a homeowner in the middle of a quiet afternoon, you have to understand the rot behind them. The structure Tina designed, fed, and weaponized. It wasn't random. It wasn't accidental. It was intentional power layered over cowardice masquerading as authority. Tina didn't run the HOA like a board. She ran it like a paramilitary hierarchy. She demanded loyalty from her members, not cooperation. When she spoke, the board didn't vote. They nodded. They didn't debate. They obeyed. Some out of fear, some out of exhaustion, some out of the simple desire to avoid her temper. She wielded the bylaws like weapons, twisting them into tools of control instead of guidelines for community order. If a rule didn't give her enough leverage, she modified it. If a vote didn't go her way, she postponed it until the people who disagreed were unable to attend. She called it structure. Residents called it abuse. Her control seeped into everything. She monitored noise levels obsessively, sometimes stepping onto porches uninvited to complain about TV volume. She measured grass height with a ruler she kept in her purse. She scolded kids for sidewalk chalk, claiming it violated surface appearance standards. She fined a pregnant woman for leaving groceries by her door for 7 minutes because it disrupted curb appeal. None of it was about order. None of it was about community. It was about maintaining the illusion that she was the only thing standing between the neighborhood and chaos. People like Tina thrive when no one checks them. The first time she overstepped and no one fought back, she learned that silence feels like permission. The second time she overstepped and someone grumbled but complied, she learned that compliance feels like victory, and every victory made her bolder. Every ounce of power made her hungrier. Every rule she enforced made her believe she was the law, rather than a temporary elected position with limited jurisdiction. She didn't understand limits. She only understood control. Mason and Twitchy were the perfect tools for her style of leadership. Mason was physically big, emotionally small. He had the presence of a man desperate for recognition, the kind who confuses intimidation with respect. He loved the idea of authority because he'd never earned any in his life. And Tina saw that in him. She nurtured it like a gardener feeding weeds. She gave him tasks. She praised his compliance. She fed him the intoxicating belief that he mattered. And for a man starved for validation, that was enough to turn him into her shadow. The Twitchy one was different. He wasn't driven by ego. He was driven by fear, and fear is even more dangerous when pointed in the wrong direction. He wanted to please. He wanted to belong. He wanted assurance that he wasn't useless. Tina offered him validation in exchange for obedience. She didn't care if he was unstable. She cared that he listened. And he did. He followed every word she gave him like it was a commandment. Together, they became her hands, her eyes, her enforcers. And because the board never challenged her, because residents whispered instead of reporting her, because fear made more noise than courage, Tina believed her power was absolute. She structured the HOA as if it were a command chain. She issued internal directives that weren't voted on. She drafted amendments without approval and circulated them as if they were law. She conducted secret meetings with her 2-man security squad, convincing them they had legitimate authority. She even purchased tactical vests using HOA funds, money that should have gone to landscaping, maintenance, or community improvements. But for her, image mattered more than legality. The scariest part wasn't that she did it. The scariest part was that she got away with it. Residents knew something was wrong. They felt it every time the security duo patrolled at night, shining flashlights into driveways. They felt it every time they received a letter threatening fines that were never discussed at meetings. They felt it every time Tina stood on their porches, arms crossed, voice sharp, eyes scanning for imperfections. But fear kept them silent, and silence fed her. I saw the pattern immediately. I'd spent years analyzing human structures, militias, insurgent cells, corrupt military units, rogue enforcement groups. The symptoms were identical. Power without oversight becomes self-sustaining. It grows like mold in the dark. The more people avoid confronting it, the stronger it becomes. The first time I attended an HOA meeting, I watched Tina run it like she was commanding a briefing. She shut down questions politely disguised as insults. She dismissed concerns with, "We'll take that under advisement." She overrode a board member who disagreed by citing a rule she invented on the spot. Mason and Twitchy stood in the back of the room, arms folded, making sure everyone saw them. It was theater, bad theater, but theater designed to intimidate. When my presence didn't rattle her, when I didn't shrink like she expected, her fixation deepened. She asked invasive questions. Where had I lived before? What was my job? Why did I need dangerous equipment in my garage? She didn't know anything about me, but she wanted to. She wanted my history laid out in front of her like a file she could study for weaknesses. And when I didn't give her answers, she grew suspicious. Her suspicion turned into frustration. Frustration turned into hostility. And hostility turned into her worst decision, targeting me. The neighborhood saw the shift. Neighbors would mutter, "She's got her eye on you," with the same tone people use when they see storm clouds forming. Some even warned me quietly that Tina had been talking about me in meetings I didn't attend. High-risk resident. Potential threat. Non-compliant. She crafted a narrative that painted me as dangerous. Not because I was, but because she needed a reason to justify her obsession. So, that was the beginning of the escalation. And escalation is a slippery slope. Tina started sending Mason and Twitchy to my house more frequently. Routine checks. Follow-ups. Compliance assessments. None of which were legal. None of which were approved. None of which had any basis in the bylaws. But once you convince yourself you're the authority, everything looks like justification. Mason walked around my property like he was inspecting a military checkpoint. The Twitchy one followed behind, fidgeting with his vest, watching me like I might explode at any moment. I told them they had no authority. Mason didn't care. Fear makes people listen. Tina had given him enough fear to use. He enjoyed the reactions. He enjoyed the power. He enjoyed the illusion that the neighborhood relied on him to maintain order. But order is fragile when built on lies. And lies become cracks when confronted by truth. The turning point wasn't when they blocked me in the street. That was simply the day their delusion crossed the wrong line. The real turning point was something I discovered weeks earlier. Something that proved the entire HOA structure was rotten to the core. I found a document, a security authorization memo, allegedly approved by the HOA board. It bore signatures from members who later told me they had never seen it. It granted Mason and Twitchy permission to conduct community compliance interventions. It cited laws that didn't exist. It referenced authority the HOA never had. And at the bottom, in heavy ink, Tina's signature sat like a triumphant stamp of corruption. That was the day I knew Oak Ridge Meadows wasn't just mismanaged. It was compromised. Tina built a miniature dictatorship underneath a layer of suburban politeness. Mason and Twitchy were her soldiers. The residents were her subjects. And the rules were whatever made her feel powerful that morning. HOA power wasn't the problem. Tina's abuse of it was. And every dictator eventually meets someone who doesn't bow. The day they drew that gun on me was the day her entire structure began to crumble. Because they weren't the only ones who misunderstood who I was. Tina did too. And she was about to learn, with absolute clarity, how fast an empire built on fear collapses when it meets a man trained to dismantle threats. The truth didn't hit me all at once. It came in pieces, quiet pieces, subtle pieces, fragments of conversations and strange behaviors that didn't make sense until they finally fused into something undeniable. The moment I found the first crack in Tina's system, Everything else fell into place like a puzzle that had been waiting for someone to stop pretending it wasn't broken. The HOA wasn't simply overreaching. It wasn't simply strict. It wasn't even simply corrupt. It was operating on foundations so illegal that once exposed, the entire neighborhood would shake under the weight of it. End. It started with an email. Not even one meant for me. A neighbor named Allison came by one evening, nervous, glancing over her shoulder like she expected Tina herself to appear from behind a tree. She said she had received a threatening message telling her she owed fines for unapproved decorative items. The so-called items were 2 potted plants. 2. She was terrified she'd lose her home over it. I told her to forward me the email. Something in her tone, in the fear she carried, didn't feel like normal HOA nonsense. The email looked official at first glance, formatted like a county document, header and all, except the county seal was wrong. Blurred, stretched, off-center. You don't spend a decade in special operations without learning how to spot forgeries in 3 seconds. I recognized a fake the moment I saw it. I dug deeper. I requested copies of the official HOA communications for the past 18 months. Tina stalled at first, pretending she didn't have access, then pretending the board would need to approve the request, then pretending the board was unavailable to vote. I didn't press. Pressure makes liars reveal themselves without being asked. A few days later, a disgruntled board member slipped me a USB drive during a HOA meeting. No words exchanged, just a quick drop in my hand like we were trading classified intel in an alley. She whispered, "You didn't get this from me," and walked away with the kind of speed guilt creates. When I opened the files, the truth glared back like a spotlight. Nothing was approved. Nothing was voted on. Nothing Tina implemented had any actual authorization, so? She forged half the board signatures using a digital tool so cheap I could have spotted it from across the room. The timestamps didn't match. The formats were inconsistent. The language in the amendments was lifted word for word from police websites, patched together like a ransom note written by someone who had no idea what the legal terms meant. She created fake citations, fake penalties, fake safety directives, and sent them from an email that looked official but was actually registered to an address using her maiden name. And it got worse. I found a folder labeled HOA Security Division. The label alone was absurd. HOAs don't have divisions, and they definitely don't have enforcement units, but inside was something darker. There were receipts, real receipts. HOA money spent on tactical vests, flashlights, imitation badges, belt equipment, radios, and even a stun gun Mason had bragged about but never shown. She bought them all with community funds, documenting them as maintenance equipment. She redirected thousands of dollars from landscaping to security training materials, which was laughable because neither Mason nor his twitchy partner had ever attended a single licensed training session. But the most damning file wasn't about equipment. It was a PDF labeled Compliance Intervention Protocol. The moment I opened it, cold anger settled into my bones. Tina had written a document outlining procedures for her officers to engage with residents. It detailed verbal confrontation strategies, corrective intervention encounters, and enforcement demonstrations. She wrote it like she was instructing a militia. She even referenced the sheriff's department as though she had consulted them, which was provably false. It wasn't just illegal. It was delusional. Then came the part that hardened everything inside me. Near the bottom of the document, beneath all the fake signatures and absurd declarations, was a list of priority compliance targets. My name was on it. Second on the list. Next to my name were words I had never seen used about me by anyone who actually knew me. Resistant, non-compliant, potentially dangerous, and requires intervention demonstration. Not requires conversation. Not requires clarification. Requires demonstration. Tina had essentially instructed 2 untrained men to confront me with force if necessary. She had weaponized their egos and pointed them directly at my front door. That wasn't enforcement. That was a threat. And threats have consequences. But I wasn't done uncovering the truth. I found recorded messages exchanged between Tina and Mason. Audio files Mason had saved, likely because he thought they made him sound important. In one, Tina tells him, "If he refuses again, escalate. Show him you're serious." In another, she says, "We can't have him thinking he gets special treatment. Handle it." The worst one came after. "If he pushes back, make sure he understands who's in charge in this neighborhood." She wasn't talking about rules. She wasn't talking about compliance. She was talking about dominance, control, breaking people. She saw homeowners as subjects and saw herself as the ruler. It was stomach-turning, the way someone with so little authority could imagine they had absolute power. But then I remembered. Small tyrants always feel the biggest when no one challenges them. The entire HOA was a facade built on lies, fear, and forged documents. The residents weren't following rules. They were being manipulated into obedience. Every action Tina took, every threat she made, every fake badge Mason flashed came from the same place. A narcissist with a title and no limits. As I kept going through the files, the pieces clicked together with unsettling clarity. Tina didn't just believe she had authority. She believed she had power beyond question. She believed the community belonged to her. She believed no one would ever challenge her. She believed Mason and Twitchy were enough to keep people quiet. And for a while, she was right. But fear doesn't win against skill. And lies don't win against evidence. And wannabe cops don't win against someone who spent a decade identifying, analyzing, and neutralizing threats. The deeper I went, the more I realized her entire structure was collapsing under its own weight. She gave Mason and Twitchy authority she didn't have. She signed documents she wasn't allowed to sign. She created positions she couldn't legally create. She instructed enforcement actions she had no right to demand. She used HOA money to fuel her fantasy of control. Every page I opened added another brick to the case against her. And then, buried in a folder marked Internal Communications, I found the file that told me everything I needed to know. It wasn't a document. It wasn't a receipt. It wasn't a directive. It was a group chat. Tina, Mason, Twitchy, and 3 board members who rarely spoke. The last message was from 2 days before the gun incident. It said, "Approach him directly. Remind him the rules apply to everyone. Don't back down this time." But the message that stopped me cold came from the board president, not Tina. It had been sent only a few hours before the encounter on the street. It read, "Do not confront him. You have no authority. Stay away from his property. No inspections, no contact. This is an order." Tina replied with a single word, "Handle it." Mason's response was instant. "On it." The Twitchy one added, "We'll make him understand." They didn't just disobey, they didn't just overreach. They intentionally ignored an order to stay away. They intentionally sought me out. They intentionally armed themselves and waited for me. They intentionally provoked confrontation. And they had no idea they had left a digital trail leading straight to them. When I closed the final file, I wasn't angry. I wasn't even surprised. I was ready. Because you don't confront a threat blindly. You confront it with evidence, with precision, with absolute clarity of what needs to be done. Tina's empire wasn't just fragile, it was already cracked. All it needed was pressure. And pressure was coming. Because once someone points a gun at me, the situation changes. And once someone tries to enforce authority they never had, consequences follow like shadows. Tina built a power structure on lies. And now those lies were becoming a noose tightening around her own neck. This wasn't just an HOA problem anymore. This was legal. This was criminal. This was intentional misconduct, documented line by line by her own hand. And she didn't know it yet, but the moment that gun lifted, the collapse had already begun. Everything Tina had built, every fake rule, every forged document, every intimidation tactic was already trembling before the moment they cut me off in the street. But that confrontation didn't just shake her empire, it detonated it. The escalation didn't begin with the gunshot. It began with the decision those two made when they stepped out of that truck, armed with arrogance, trembling courage, and the belief they could enforce laws that didn't exist. The moment they blocked my path, they turned a bad system into a criminal event. And once criminals aim a gun, they're no longer protected by excuses. They're exposed by their actions. The sun was blistering the pavement when Mason moved in closer, his shadow stretching toward me like a challenge. His partner paced behind him, trying and failing to look steady. I watched their hands, their posture, their breathing patterns. Mason's bravado came from his chest. The twitchy one's fear came from his wrists. One acted like he wanted to fight. The other looked like he'd fire without meaning to. I'd faced more skilled threats in back alleys overseas. I'd faced more disciplined enemies in deserts, but I'd never faced two grown men pretending so hard to be dangerous that they genuinely believed their own fantasies. "Sir," Mason said again, dropping his voice into a cheap imitation of authority, "we need you to answer some questions." He said it as if the badge on his vest gave him the power to command, but the badge was fake. The tone was fake. The authority was fake. Only the gun was real. And a real gun in untrained hands will always be the most dangerous part of a situation. I stopped walking, stood still, let silence build, let them feel the weight of my calm. Because calm is a language, and they didn't speak it. Calm rattles people who rely on fear to feel powerful. Calm makes them overstep. And overstepping was their specialty. "We've had reports," Mason continued, "that you've been breaking several HOA codes." His voice wavered just enough to betray the uncertainty behind the front. I let the words fall away. HOA codes, rules, warnings, citations. None of that mattered anymore. The only thing that mattered was the weapon pointed in my direction. The twitchy one, still unnamed in the files I'd found, shifted his weight from foot to foot. His hand twitched near his holster. I could see the indecision on his face. Fear and ego were wrestling inside him. People like him don't point guns because they want to shoot. They point guns because they're terrified of losing control. And when control is the only thing holding their ego together, losing it feels like death. My voice stayed low, steady, unshaken. "Move your hand off that firearm now." I didn't raise my volume. I didn't posture. I didn't threaten. I gave a command with the exact tone I used overseas, calm enough to steady men, sharp enough to warn them. He didn't listen. They never do at first. They mistake calm for weakness. They mistake discipline for fear. They mistake silence for hesitation. People misinterpret what they don't understand. Mason crossed his arms and stepped forward like he owned the street. "Sir, we're not going to tell you again. Stop resisting and comply." Resist? Comply? He spoke like those words made him powerful. He had no idea how many real men with real authority had said those same words to people who actually understood the danger behind them. Mason didn't understand anything. He only understood Tina's voice in his ear, telling him he was important. The twitchy one lifted the gun higher. That was it. The line snapped. The world shifted from tension to threat in half a heartbeat. He didn't point it fully. He didn't aim properly. He didn't brace or breathe or align. He jerked it upward in the single most reckless movement an armed man could make. And that was all it took. In that moment, violation turned into danger. Danger turned into action. I didn't choose the escalation. They did. My breath slowed. My stance adjusted. My right hand wrapped the Glock beneath my shirt. Every muscle in my body synced into the posture I had practiced thousands of times in deserts and kill houses. Focus replaced emotion. Reflex replaced thought. Training replaced fear. "Drop the gun," I said one last time. Mason smirked. "He's bluffing," he muttered loudly enough for his partner to hear. "Look at him, hands behind his back." The twitchy one swallowed hard. His gun trembled, his breath shook, sweat ran down his cheek. He wasn't built for any of this. He wasn't prepared, and he wasn't going to understand what happened until it was over. He jerked the weapon higher. I moved. 3 shots tore through the air in a crisp burst. The first hit his shoulder, spinning him violently to the left. The second hit his thigh, buckling his leg and dropping him instantly. The third shattered the gun from his hand, metal skidding across the pavement. He screamed, not from pain, but from the shock of having his delusion ripped out of him. Before the echo faded, Mason rushed me in a clumsy burst of adrenaline. Amateur mistake. He charged with his chin up, knees stiff, arms wild. I sidestepped, grabbed his wrist, twisted until the bones strained, and drove my elbow into his ribs with surgical precision. Once, twice, 3 times. The cartilage gave first. Then the breath left him in a broken gasp. He collapsed under the pressure of someone who knew exactly where to strike. He hit the pavement hard, the sound sharp enough to draw eyes from porches and windows. People emerged from their homes like a wave breaking. Phones lifted. Voices rose. Panic spread. The twitchy one writhed on the ground, clutching his shoulder and leg. Mason lay gasping, wheezing through shattered ribs and trying to roll onto his side but failing. I stepped back, lowered my Glock, pointed it toward the ground, and projected my voice so the entire street could hear. Weapon secure, self-defense. They drew first. I didn't need to shout. The truth carried itself. Neighbors flooded the street. Someone screamed, "Call the cops!" Another shouted, "They pulled a gun on him!" A third yelled, "They're not real officers!" The entire scene erupted into chaos. Cars stopped, doors opened, cameras pointed like dozens of witnesses focused through lenses. The truth was being recorded from every angle, and neither Mason nor his partner could hide behind lies anymore. I holstered my weapon, raised my hands, and stepped away from their bodies. I wasn't just protecting myself. I was preventing the twitchy one, injured as he was, from trying anything stupid in panic. Mason's breathing sounded like a deflated lung, short and ragged. He coughed and managed to croak, We were doing our job." My eyes hardened. "Impersonating officers is not a job," I said. "It's a crime." Sirens cut through the neighborhood's fear. Louder, closer, urgent. 3 police cruisers rounded the corner at high speed, lights bouncing off windows and fences. They stopped so fast I could feel the wind push against my shirt. Officers poured out, weapons raised, tension electrifying the air. "Hands where we can see them," one shouted. I lifted them above my head as smooth as water rising. "Weapon holstered," I said. "Suspects down, one armed." They initiated the confrontation. Officers swarmed. 2 handcuffed me, standard procedure, and 1 collected my Glock from its holster. Paramedics rushed past us toward the fallen duo. The twitchy one cried out as they turned him. Mason groaned, clutching his ribs with a hand that kept trembling from shock. Sheriff Daniels arrived minutes later, stepping out of his SUV with the calm stride of a man who had seen every version of chaos a small town could offer. He scanned the scene once, just once, and in that single sweep he understood everything. He walked toward me with deliberate steps, his eyes moving between my posture, the suspect's wounds, the discarded gun lying yards away, and the cluster of residents all shouting the same story. They pulled a gun first. "You the homeowner?" he asked. "Yes," I said. He nodded toward the twitchy one. "That one pulled on you?" "Yes." Daniels exhaled slowly, like he was disappointed but not surprised. "They're wearing fake badges," he said. "We've seen these guys causing trouble." I looked directly at him. If I hadn't acted, Sheriff, someone wouldn't be standing here right now. He studied me for a moment. My stance, my breath, the calm that hadn't left my eyes since the escalation began. "You military?" he asked. I hesitated just long enough to choose honesty. "Navy SEAL, still active reserve." Daniels let out a low whistle. "Explains the precision," he said. "Next time, call us first." I nodded. "Next time," I replied coldly. "They won't get the chance." Neighbors gave statements. Videos were played. Witnesses repeated the same narrative until it formed a chorus of truth. The twitchy one, pale and trembling, muttered Tina's name repeatedly. Mason tried to claim they were following official directives, but Daniel shot that down with a single sentence. "There's no such thing as HOA police." As paramedics loaded Mason into the ambulance, he locked eyes with me. Fear replaced his bravado. Pain replaced arrogance. He looked at me like a man who had discovered the hard way that wearing a uniform doesn't make you powerful, that training does. The twitchy one cried out when they lifted his leg. A clean break and a shredded thigh. He'd live, but he'd walk differently for the rest of his life. He whispered, "She told us to do it," to the paramedic, who repeated the words aloud for the sheriff to hear. Daniel scribbled something in his notebook. The first domino had fallen. The escalation had begun. Everything Tina built was about to collapse. Not because I fired. Not because I fought back. But because for the first time someone exposed the truth she'd been hiding behind, threats and fake authority. The street wasn't the battlefield. The battlefield was coming next, inside courtrooms, sheriff offices, and HOA meetings where lies would be dissected under fluorescent lights. And for the first time in her reign, Tina Marsh was about to learn what real accountability felt like. Why, retaliation didn't begin with anger. It began with clarity. Standing on that street, wrists cuffed, watching paramedics load 2 broken men into ambulances, I felt something shift inside me. Not rage, not satisfaction, but a level of focus that only comes after years of training yourself to move with purpose rather than emotion. Revenge is a reaction, retaliation is a strategy, and strategy is something I had mastered long before Tina Marsh ever learned how to spell the word authority. Sheriff Daniels uncuffed me the moment the first statements from neighbors matched mine. The decision was quick, clean, procedural. He handed me my Glock in a sealed evidence bag, told me it would be returned once the paperwork cleared, and asked if I needed medical attention. I didn't. I'd walked through worse storms with blood in my mouth and sand in my teeth. This wasn't trauma. This was the beginning of exposure. By sunset, half the neighborhood knew. By morning, everyone did. Phones had captured everything. The gun being drawn, the threats, the confrontation, the shots, the takedown. Videos spread through group chats like wildfire. Residents watched them with wide eyes, as if seeing the truth for the first time. People who had whispered about Tina for months suddenly realized they'd been living under a soft dictatorship, manipulated by an unstable woman who weaponized fear. And when people finally see fear clearly, they stop obeying it. I spent the morning gathering everything I needed. Not out of vengeance, out of duty. There's a difference. Vengeance wants to hurt. Duty wants to correct. And there was a lot that needed correcting. The first report went to the sheriff's department. Not an informal conversation, not a complaint, but a fully documented statement supported by video evidence and the files I had collected. Evidence of impersonating law enforcement. Evidence of unlawful brandishing of a firearm. Evidence of conspiracy. Evidence of false authority. Evidence of illegal use of HOA funds. Evidence of forged signatures, falsified emails, and fabricated rules. It wasn't just a case. It was a collapse waiting to happen. Deputy Ortiz, the one assigned to process my statement, stared at the pile of documents as though I'd just dropped a classified dossier in front of him. "This is a lot," he said. "It's enough," I replied calmly. "And there's more if you need it." He took the files with careful hands, the way officers take evidence they know will define the entire case. The second report went to the district attorney's office. I wasn't guessing, hoping, or assuming. I was filing. I'd worked alongside government channels long enough to know how they think, how they operate, and how they prioritize. A case involving impersonation of officers, armed intimidation, organized conspiracy, and misuse of community funds? That wasn't small-town drama. That was felony-level behavior wrapped in negligence and arrogance. The DA's receptionist tried to schedule me for the following week, but when she saw the words "armed impersonation" on the form, she called a prosecutor immediately. Assistant DA Harper reviewed the initial packet in silence, eyebrows tightening with every page she turned. "You're telling me," she said slowly, "that the HOA President formed her own security force?" "Yes." "Purchased equipment with community money?" "Yes." "And authorized these two men to conduct armed enforcement?" "Yes." "And you have proof?" I slid another folder across her desk. She didn't speak. She didn't exhale. She simply reached for the phone and said, "Get Daniels in here, now." The machine was moving. Meanwhile, Oak Ridge Meadows shifted under the weight of the truth. Word spread that Mason and the Twitchy partner had been moved to separate wings of the county hospital under heavy monitoring, not just for their injuries, but because officers needed to ensure they didn't coordinate their stories. Pain loosens tongues, and desperation loosens them further. It didn't take long. By mid-afternoon, Sheriff Daniels called me personally. His voice carried that mixture of disbelief and simmering anger. Anger not at me, but at the stupidity that had unfolded under his jurisdiction. "They talked," he said. "Both of them." I waited. "They admitted Tina sent them." That was the first domino. "They admitted she promised them money to bring you into compliance." That was the second. "And they admitted they ignored a direct message from the HOA President telling them to stay away from your property." That was the third. The avalanche had begun. The state HOA regulatory office contacted me next. They weren't a law enforcement agency, but they had the authority to dismantle entire boards, audit financial records, and impose crippling fines for misconduct. When I told the investigator that the HOA president forged signatures, created unauthorized positions, and misappropriated funds, she didn't even pretend to hide her shock. "This is one of the worst cases I've seen," she said. "We're dispatching a team." A team. Not a representative. A team. Because Tina hadn't just bent the rules, she had twisted them into a weapon. By the following day, neighbors who once avoided me approached with gratitude, fear, and relief. A retired school teacher told me she had been fined 6 times for improper tool storage, even though she didn't own tools. A single father explained that Mason had threatened to report him to county safety officers because his teenage son rode a bike on the sidewalk. A newlywed couple told me the twitchy one had knocked on their door at 11 p.m., demanding to see their garage compliance certificate, a document that did not exist. Every story painted the same picture. Tina's HOA wasn't management. It was extortion wrapped in suburban routine. People who had been afraid for months were finally speaking. Because once someone stands up to a bully, others realize they can stand too. The retaliation wasn't about punishing Tina. It was about dismantling the entire structure she had manipulated, and destruction requires precision. Sheriff Daniels executed the first blow. He issued warrants for all 3, Mason, Twitchy, and Tina. Mason and his partner were already in custody due to their injuries, but Tina wasn't. Deputies arrived at her door early the next morning. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood that she answered the door wearing a silk robe and an expression of righteous indignation. She demanded to know what the meaning of this intrusion was. She tried to block the door. She tried to invoke HOA immunity, a phrase that made deputies laugh as they cuffed her hands behind her back. She shouted at neighbors who recorded her arrest. "This is harassment! I did nothing wrong! He provoked them! He's dangerous! I was protecting the community!" Every sentence she screamed was a confession wearing desperation. Deputies walked her down her driveway while half the neighborhood watched. The same people she had fined, threatened, and bullied stood silently, their eyes cold. Intimidation dies quickly when the illusion behind it collapses. People who fear tyrants stop fearing the moment they see them powerless. The expert retaliation continued where it mattered most, in the courtroom and in the paperwork. The district attorney filed charges so swiftly it felt like the ink was still wet. Conspiracy, solicitation, abuse of authority, misappropriation of funds, fraudulent documentation, impersonation by proxy. Each charge added another weight to Tina's downfall. She cried during arraignment, claiming she never intended harm. But intent doesn't erase the consequences. The law doesn't bend for delusion. The fake cops faced their own charges: impersonating law enforcement, assault with a deadly weapon, criminal trespass, aggravated intimidation, reckless endangerment. Their hospital beds became holding cells. Their injuries didn't earn sympathy, they earned evidence tags. The HOA Regulatory Board dissolved the entire leadership team in a single meeting. Residents voted in a temporary committee within days. Signs went up announcing emergency audits. Letters arrived notifying everyone that previous fines issued under Tina's rule were voided. Families who had lived under fear finally exhaled. A neighborhood that once felt like a quiet battlefield was starting to feel like a community again. And through all of it, I moved with calm efficiency, filing, confirming, signing, documenting. I wasn't driven by emotion. I wasn't driven by victory. I was driven by responsibility. The responsibility to make sure no one else had to endure the kind of intimidation that had led two fools to point a gun at me. People began thanking me, shaking my hand, offering meals, sending cards. I appreciated it, but I didn't need it. I hadn't done any of this for gratitude. I'd done it because someone had to stand up, and I was capable of doing it. That's all. But even with all the legal destruction happening around her, Tina hadn't faced the final blow. That came when Sheriff Daniels knocked on my door holding a thick folder. His lips twitched into a smirk. "You're cleared," he said. "Completely justified use of force. No charges, no civil liability." I opened the folder. There it was. The official ruling, stamped, signed, final. Everything I did that day was justified. Every action, every shot, every decision. "Good," I said quietly. Because the moment they pointed that gun, there was never going to be another outcome. Daniels nodded. "You did this town a favor," he said. "More than you know." He wasn't wrong. The entire HOA system had been infected, rotting from Tina's influence. Now it was clean. Not perfect, not flawless, but clean enough that people could rebuild without fear. Retaliation wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't explosive. It was steady, precise, unstoppable. Tina thought she ran the neighborhood. Mason thought he controlled the streets. The twitchy one thought he could bluff with a gun. They all thought fear made them powerful. What they didn't understand was simple. Fear collapses when it meets skill. Authority collapses when it meets truth. Corruption collapses when someone shines a light on it. I didn't destroy them. They destroyed themselves. All I did was show the world the truth. Victory didn't come with cheers. It didn't come with celebration or noise or some dramatic moment where the neighborhood gathered around me like I'd saved a town from disaster. Real victory is quieter, heavier. It settles in slowly, like a weight lifting off your shoulders 1 ounce at a time. And the day after Tina, Mason, and the twitchy one were removed from Oak Ridge Meadows, that silence felt different. Not the tense, suffocating quiet the HOA had imposed, but the kind that comes when a storm finally breaks and the world breathes again. I took a slow walk down the same street where the confrontation happened. The pavement was clean, as if time had washed away the chaos, but I remembered every detail: the blinding sun, the flash of steel, the tension coiled in my muscles just before everything snapped. Now kids were back on their bikes, chalk drawings spread across the driveways, and neighbors walked their dogs without looking over their shoulders. Peace returned, not because the HOA allowed it, but because those who corrupted it were gone. News traveled fast. It always does in communities where fear once ruled. Overnight, half the old HOA board resigned. Some left quietly, some left in shame. A few left furious, insisting they didn't know what Tina was doing, even though their signatures, or forged versions of them, were plastered all over the documents I'd uncovered. The remaining members called an emergency meeting, which was the first one in years that wasn't run like a military briefing by a suburban dictator. Residents packed the room. Not to argue, not to bicker, but to reclaim what had been stolen. The simple right to feel safe in their own homes. When they voted to dissolve the entire board and replace it with a temporary committee, the applause wasn't loud, but it was sincere. The kind of applause that said people finally understood they weren't powerless. They had just been fooled into thinking they were. The district attorney's office didn't waste time either. The twitchy one, still in the hospital, confessed fully. His injuries weren't life-threatening, but they were career-ending, even if he'd had a career to end. His shoulder needed reconstruction. His thigh required rods. His gun hand was damaged enough to guarantee he'd never hold a weapon with stability again. He cried through most of the deposition, and though I believed he felt sorry, I also knew his regret was born from consequences, not conscience. Mason faced his own reckoning. 3 cracked ribs, a punctured lung, permanent nerve injury in his left arm, painkiller drip running into his IV. He didn't cry. He didn't break down. But the look in his eyes told a story his mouth never would. The fantasy was over. The badge he loved to wear wasn't a symbol of power anymore. It was evidence. And in one recorded interview, his voice shaking despite his attempts to sound tough, he admitted Tina had pushed him into escalating against me. He said she told him I needed to be shown the rules, as if rules were weapons, and he was the hand meant to swing them. Tina, meanwhile, had the kind of fall that only happens when arrogance collapses under the weight of reality. The mugshot said it all. Smugness wiped clean, replaced by the stunned expression of someone realizing the system they manipulated had shifted its aim back at them. She tried to deny everything at first, but the documents I provided left no room for lies. Her forged signatures, her unauthorized directives, her misuse of funds, her messages encouraging escalation, her voice recordings, her list of priority compliance targets. All of it dragged her deeper into the pit she dug with her own hands. When she was sentenced to 18 months in county jail, she broke down in the courtroom, begging the judge for leniency. She claimed she only wanted to maintain order, that she never meant harm, that she had no idea Mason and the other one would act that way. But intent doesn't erase outcomes, and fantasy doesn't replace law. The judge didn't waver. Your abuse of authority created the conditions for violence, he said. This neighborhood is safer without your leadership. It was the kind of sentence that didn't just end her reign. It erased it. A few days later, Sheriff Daniels returned to my house with the final official report. He handed it to me with the same steady composure he'd shown during the entire investigation. His uniform looked crisp under the afternoon light, but the tired lines on his face told the truth. This case had irritated him on a level that went beyond paperwork and procedure. "You're cleared," he said simply. "Self-defense, completely justified. There won't be any charges, and there won't be any civil suits either. Everything checks out." I took the report in my hands. The weight of the document felt heavier than the paper itself, not because I feared what it might say, but because it represented the end of a process that never should have been necessary. "Good," I said quietly, looking towards the stretch of pavement where it all happened. Because once they decided to threaten me, this was the only outcome. Daniels nodded. "Word is half the HOA just quit, walked out, didn't even finish the meeting." There was a hint of a smirk in his voice. He didn't often enjoy these moments, but this one was an exception. "Then it's already a better neighborhood," I said. He chuckled, exhaling slowly, as if releasing tension he'd been holding for days. "You know," he added, "most people wouldn't have handled that situation the way you did." I shrugged. "Most people don't spend a decade preparing for it." When he left, the quiet wasn't oppressive. It wasn't heavy. It wasn't waiting for danger. It was peaceful, the kind of peace I had moved here for, the kind of peace the HOA had stolen, the kind of peace that finally felt earned again. As I walked back inside, neighbors waved with genuine warmth. A few came over to thank me again. One elderly man said he finally slept without worry for the first time in months. A young mother told me her son went back to riding his bike without fear. A couple down the street said they used to avoid leaving their garage at night because the security patrols made them feel hunted. Hearing their relief made every step of the fight worth it. But I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I didn't feel victorious in the way people imagine victory feels. I just felt steady, settled, grounded. Because justice isn't a celebration. It's a correction. And what happened in Oak Ridge Meadows wasn't just punishment for 3 people who abused their positions. It was a reset for an entire community that had forgotten what freedom looked like. When the sun began to set, I returned to the spot where the white truck had blocked my path. The street was calm now, bathed in gold light. A breeze brushed across the asphalt. For the first time since I moved in, the neighborhood felt like home. Not perfect, not flawless, but honest. And in that moment, I understood something deeper. The reason Mason and Twitchy froze when I said Navy SEAL wasn't just fear of the title, it was recognition. They finally realized they weren't standing in front of a man who could be bullied or manipulated or intimidated. They were standing in front of someone who didn't operate on fear at all. Someone trained to face danger, not cower before it. Someone who had seen real authority, real enforcement, real consequences. They learned too late that real power isn't loud. Real power isn't boastful. Real power doesn't need a vest or a fake badge or a trembling gun. Real power stands calmly in the face of danger and says, "No." When I turned back toward my house, the street felt lighter, safer, better. Not because I was a hero, not because I fought, but because someone finally said enough. Tina thought she ran this neighborhood. Mason thought he controlled these streets. The twitchy one thought he could enforce fear with a gun. But the truth was simple. They were all afraid of the wrong thing. They thought HOA authority made them untouchable. They thought intimidation made them strong. They thought threats made them powerful. What they should have feared, what they finally understood too late, were the words that ended their entire reign. Navy SEAL,